Bubba. I know you think that you, Bushy, Bagot, and Green are all the best of friends, but they're nothing but flatterers who will be quickly dispatched. And while they may never part of their own free will because they're living up the good life with you, even the best of fools will meet their untimely ends when Bolingbroke catches up with them. So why pretend that you didn't expect that there would be consequences for your actions? You know that you are complicit in your Uncle Gloucester's death, banishing Bolingbroke and Sir Thomas Mowbray, whom you instructed to kill Gloucester, and confiscating John of Gaunt's property to fund your Irish wars. This is the end of your free reign, and you'll have to find out for yourself that these decisions will lead to your loss of that hollow crown. Go on and ask somebody else, like your uncle, the Duke of York, what price that you're going to pay for these actions. You might say that I'm wrong to predict your downfall because you were decreed by God to be king. But if I were you, I would go away, so far away, perhaps to France with your wife, the Queen. Believe me, it's too late to turn back now that you've said that you would surrender your crown, and it don't matter anyhow. You can't go on the same old way and keep up the same old game. And as for your suggestion that I should give Bolingbroke your crown, I'm sorry, I can't take it. I can't take it, my lord. I said I just can't take it, so ask me no more. Your Majesty, why can't you just get it through your head? Your reign? It's over now. Yes, you heard me clearly now. I said, it's over. It's over now. I've always considered Richard III to be an absolute masterpiece, and because of that, I never really appreciated how good Richard II was as a play until I did the research for this particular episode. But having watched it and read it about 15 times now, I can tell you it is also a masterpiece. Before we get into the plot summary, I wanted to point out that in the 1993 movie Dave, Kevin Kline stands in for the real president of the United States and must stay in the job when the real president suffers a stroke. Ironically, he does a better job than the real president. In Richard II, the king takes over at 10 years of age when his grandfather dies unexpectedly. And while he is the legitimate king, he is not very good at his job, and there is no official procedure for getting rid of him. So let's take a look at the plot of Richard II. The play begins with King Richard majestically sitting on his throne in full state, having been requested to arbitrate a dispute between Thomas Mowbray and Richard's cousin Henry Bolingbroke. Later, Henry IV, who has accused Mowbray of squandering money Richard gave him for the king's soldiers and murdering Bolingbroke's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. Meanwhile, John of Gaunt, his father, first Duke of Lancaster, believes King Richard himself was responsible for his brother's murder, which he was. After several attempts to calm the men down, Richard decides that the matter should be resolved through a trial of battle between Bolingbroke and Mowbray. Following a long ceremonial introduction, and just as the combatants are about to fight, Richard stops the battle and banishes both men from England. Bolingbroke is originally sentenced to 10 years banishment, but Richard reduces his sentence to 6 years after seeing John of Gaunt, his father, grieving for his son. Mowbray, however, is banished for life. This decision is the first mistake in a long series of mistakes leading to King Richard's overthrow and death, and magnifies many of his character flaws, including indecisiveness in first ordering the duel and then not allowing it to proceed, impulsiveness as he waits until the last possible moment to cancel the combat, and randomness for the arbitrary and different lengths of banishment between Bolingbroke and Mowbray. Also, the decision fails to eliminate the suspicion surrounding Richard's involvement in the death of the Duke of Gloucester. On the contrary, By handling the situation so high-handedly and offering no explanation for his decisions, Richard, in fact, makes himself appear even guiltier. Mowbray correctly prophesies that the king will eventually fall at the hand of Bolingbroke. After an impassioned tirade against the visiting king, on his deathbed, John of Gaunt dies, and Richard seizes all of his lands and money. This angers the nobility, who accuse Richard of wasting England's money and using John of Gaunt's money, which rightly belongs to his son Bolingbroke, to fund a war in Ireland. He also taxes the commoners and fines the nobles for crimes their ancestors committed. As a result, the nobility helped Bolingbroke secretly turn to England with a plan to overthrow Richard II. However, a few subjects remain loyal to the king. Among them are Bushy, Bagot, and Green, as well as the Duke of Aumerle, son of the Duke of York, and a cousin to both Richard and Bolingbroke. When Richard leaves England to head up the war in Ireland, Bolingbroke assembles an army and invades the north coast of England. He executes Bushy and Green and wins over the Duke of York, whom Richard left in charge of his government during his absence. When Richard returns, he not only grants Bolingbroke's request for his father's land, he also gives up his claim to the throne. After a dramatic public ceremony where he has the captive king publicly renounce his crown, Bolingbroke crowns himself King Henry IV and has Richard taken prisoner in a castle in Pomfret. Aumerle and the others plan a rebellion against Henry IV, but his father discovers his treachery and reveals it to Henry. The king executes every conspirator except Aumerle, who is spared because his mother intervenes on his behalf, and the Bishop of Carlisle, who, though he opposed Henry IV, always acted honorably. After believing that King Henry wants the still-living Richard murdered, an ambitious nobleman named Sir Piers Exton enters the prison and murders Richard. King Henry is appalled by Richard's murder and vows to journey to the Holy Land to cleanse himself of his own part in Richard's death. The play ends with Henry mourning over Richard's coffin and yearning for forgiveness, saying, "Lords, I protest my soul is full of woe, that blood should sprinkle me to make me grow. Come, mourn with me, for that I do lament, and put on sullen black incontinent. I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land, to wash this blood off from my guilty hand. March sadly after, grace my mournings here, in weeping after this untimely bier." When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Richard II. All right, now let's take a look at some of the major characters in this play. We'll start with Richard II himself. He's the King of England and has been the reigning monarch for the past 20 years when the play begins. Harry Bolingbroke is Richard's cousin, and he'll eventually become Henry IV before the play is over. John of Gaunt is Richard's uncle and Henry Bolingbroke's elderly father. He was also one of Richard's counselors when he was younger. The Duke of York is also Richard's uncle and John of Gaunt's brother, and although he is very loyal to Richard, when Bolingbroke does become king, York is willing to turn in his own son, the Duke of Aumerle, as a traitor when he learns of his involvement to kill Henry IV. The Queen is Richard's wife, and she's never mentioned by name because she's actually an amalgam of Richard's first two wives and doesn't have a very big part in the play. Sir Thomas Mowbray is the Duke of Norfolk, who was accused of being a traitor and killing Henry Bolingbroke's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. Although he denies it, he actually did kill Gloucester, but covertly under direct orders from Richard II, who doesn't want that information getting out. Incidentally, this is probably why he banishes both Mowbray and Bolingbroke. And finally, we have the Bishop of Carlisle, who, although he stayed loyal to Richard II and opposed Henry IV's succession, Henry mercifully pardons him because he'd always acted honorably. Similarly, in Henry IV, Part 2, we'll see his son Henry V reward his stern tutor, the Lord Chief Justice, for being a disciplinarian to him when he was an unruly child himself. When we get back, we'll look at some of the major plot devices and memorable scenes in Richard II. One of the most interesting plot devices in Richard II is his repeated number of mistakes, so let's count some of them down. First, he sets a date of combat for Bolingbroke and Mowbray to settle their dispute. Second, he stops the combat just at the moment that it was supposed to begin. Number 3, he banishes Bolingbroke for 10 years, Mowbray for life. That makes no sense. Number 4, he arbitrarily reduces Bolingbroke's banishment from 10 years to 6 on a whim to satisfy John of Gaunt. Number 5, he lets both of his enemies live so that Bolingbroke can come back and challenge him for his crown. Big mistake. Number 6, he seizes all of John of Gaunt's property upon his death, outraging Bolingbroke to return and reclaim his inheritance. Number 7, when Bolingbroke asks for his father's lands to be returned, Richard also gives him his entire kingdom at the same time. It's like that old Henny Youngman joke, take my wife, please. Only here it's, take my kingdom, please. It's also not surprising that Shakespeare used some prophecies in this play. The first one is about Thomas Mowbray warning Richard that Bolingbroke may be his usurper. Next, Richard says that Northumberland will soon be a threat to Bolingbroke because if you could depose one king, you could depose another. Richard also says the same thing to Bolingbroke after he's been deposed. And the Bishop of Carlisle also warns that Henry IV will face an ongoing threat on his life for usurping the crown. And as you should know by now in Shakespeare, if it's a prophecy, it's going to come true. We also have an incredibly memorable scene in Act 3, Scene 2, when Richard delivers his most famous speech about the hollow crown. And in this moment, we see his vulnerability, his insecurities, and his despair. Here we see him learning about his devastating loss of 20,000 soldiers and Bolingbroke's ascension in power. No matter where, of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills, and yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies on the ground? Our lands, our lives, and all are Bolingbroke's, and nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king, keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable, and humored thus comes at the last with a little pin, bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty. For you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends, subjected thus, How can you say to me, I am a king? It almost feels like Shakespeare is showing off his talent for entering the psyche of his character. Regardless of what you may think of Richard II, it would be virtually impossible not to feel compassion to him in this devastating moment of loss. All right, now let's start with some of the themes that run through Richard II. We'll start with upward and downward mobility. In Richard II, it's easy to watch Richard's rapid decline, having reigned for the most part unopposed for 20 years, and in the last 2 years of his kingship, lose everything, including his life. At the same time, we see Henry Bolingbroke go from being the cousin to the king to being banished for 6 years and then returning to England with an army supposedly only there to make sure that he gets his father's land back, but in reality, he winds up usurping his cousin and becoming King of England. What's really important to remember is that Henry Bolingbroke always demonstrated respect for the common citizens of England, while Richard II mocks him for it and loses the support of the people because of his extravagant lifestyle. Let's look at two other major themes in the play, loyalty and entitlement. The major dilemma in Richard II is that you have a legitimately appointed king who is not very good at his job. Unlike Richard III, who is a tyrant, Richard II's subjects really have no legal remedy or justification for removing him. However, it's Richard himself who is responsible for his downfall. He lived a lavish lifestyle and couldn't afford to pay for it without taxing his subjects unjustly. His entitlement mentality was his Achilles heel. He also had no right to confiscate John of Gaunt's lands and property, which resulted in Henry Bolingbroke returning to England and removing him from the throne. One by one, Richard's actions caused him to lose the loyalty of virtually everyone. But whether or not his cousin had the right to remove him, Richard himself decides to give up his throne when all Bolingbroke said was he wanted his inheritance back and his banishment repealed. In Act 3, Scene 3, we see Richard overreact, and it cost him his crown, his kingdom, and eventually his life. When Bolingbroke meets Richard at Flint Castle, he meets a king ready to give up. Here's his down speech. What must the king do now? Must he submit? The king shall do it. Must he be deposed? The king is contented. Must he lose the name of king? In God's name, let it go. I give my jewels for a set of beads, my gorgeous palace for hermitage, my gay apparel for an almsman's gown, my figured goblets for a dish of wood, my scepter for a palmer's walking staff, my subjects for a pair of carved saints, and my large kingdom for a little grave, grave, an obscure grave, or I'll be buried on the king's highway, some way of common trade, where subjects' feet may hourly trample on their sovereign's head. For on my heart they tread now, whilst I live, and buried once, why not upon my head? Most mighty prince, my lord Northumberland, what says King Bolingbroke? Will his majesty give Richard leave to live till Richard die? You make leg, and Bolingbroke says I. Northumberland says, My lord, in the base court he doth attend to speak with you. May it please you to come down. And Richard replies, Down, down I come, like glistering Phaeton, wanting the manage of unruly jades, in the base court, where kings grow base, to come at traitors' calls, and do them grace. In the base court come down, down court, down king, for night owls shriek, where mounting larks should sing. Let's face it, would you want this man to be your king? What really sets Richard II apart from other works is the magnificent dialogue that runs throughout the entire play. In Act 2, Scene 1, John of Gaunt, on his deathbed, calls out his nephew Richard for having mishandled himself as a king, and in his sceptered isle speech says, "This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in a silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier days, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous for their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service and true chivalry, as is the sepulchre in stubborn Jewry of the world's ransom, Blessed Mary's Son. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inking blots and rotten parchment bonds, that England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Also, in Act 4, Scene 1, Richard finally agrees to hand over his crown to Bolingbroke. This is his abdication speak. Therefore, no, for I resign to thee. Now mark me how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head, and this unwieldy scepter from my hand, this pride of kingly sway from out my heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm, with my own hands I give away my crown, with mine own tongue deny my sacred state, with mine own breath release all duteous oaths. All pomp and majesty I do forswear, my manners, rents, revenues I forego, my acts, decrees, and statutes I deny. God pardon all oaths that are broke to me, God keep all vows unbroke are made to thee. Make me that nothing have, with nothing grieved, and thou withal, pleased that hast all achieved. Long mayest thou live in Richard's seat to sit, and soon lie Richard in an earthy pit. God save King Henry, unkinged Richard says, and send him many years of sunshine days. At that point, Henry Bolingbroke, now crowned Henry IV, decides to show Richard a little compassion and orders Northumberland not to press any more demands of the deposed king. When we get back, we'll look at some of the major turning points and correlations in Richard II. Let's take a look at some of the major turning points and correlations in this play. Several of the most important turning points about Richard II actually take place before the play even begins. First, Richard's grandfather, Edward III, outlived Richard's father, Edward of Woodstock, who was known as the Black Prince. Richard's father was considered an excellent warrior and an ideal successor to the throne. However, because of his untimely death, Richard II became king when he was only 10 years of age. Second, Richard successfully ended the peasants' revolt when he was only 14 years old, telling the mob, "I am your captain, follow me." This was significant because now Richard had confidence that he could lead himself. Third, Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died in 1397. After her death, Richard became very violent and very bloody. He began to take action against his advisors who had ordered him around when he was younger. Fourth, Richard, who had grown tired of his overbearing uncle Thomas of Woodstock, also known as the Duke of Gloucester, ordered Thomas Mowbray to have him killed. Fifth, a major turning point that actually does take place in the play is when Richard II confiscates John of Gaunt's lands and properties after his death, thus motivating the banished Henry Bolingbroke to return to seek justice, resulting in him deposing his cousin and becoming King Henry IV. Richard II also contains some interesting correlations. For example, there are many biblical references in this play, most notably Richard comparing himself to Jesus, saying, "Christ in 12 found truth in all but one. I in 12,000, none." He also goes on to say, "Though some of you with Pilate wash your hands, showing an outward pity, yet you Pilates have here delivered me to my sour cross, and water cannot wash away your sin." Talk about having a God complex. And finally, at the end of Richard II, Exton kills Richard in Pomfret because he thinks Henry IV will thank him for it, but he doesn't. Instead, he rebukes him and banishes him, saying, "Exton, I thank thee not, for thou hast wrought a deed of slander with thy fatal hand upon my head and all this famous land. Though I did wish him dead, I hate the murderer, love him murdered. With Cain go wander through the shades of night, and never show thy head by day nor night." There's also another correlation in Antony and Cleopatra. Minos offers to cut the triumvirate's throats and make Pompey king of the world. However, Pompey refuses, saying it would be dishonorable for Minos to do so if Pompey had knowledge of it beforehand. Instead, Pompey says, "This should have been done and not spoken on it. In me 'tis villainy, in thee it had been good service. Thou must know 'tis not my profit that does lead mine honor it. Being done unknown, I should have found it afterwards well done, but must condemn it now." In preparing for this episode, I did some research, and I wanted to share some interesting facts about Richard II that I found with you. In 1601, 6 years after the play was written, the second Earl of Essex planned an uprising against Queen Elizabeth and commissioned the Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's company, to perform Richard II in hopes of inciting support for his insurrection. However, the insurrection was quickly squashed, and Essex was executed for his actions. Neither Shakespeare nor the Chamberlain's men received any sanctions and were cleared of any involvement in the plot. However, Queen Elizabeth was famously noted for saying of the play, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" Richard II became King of England when he was only 10 years old and was ruled by advisors until he became of age. When he was only 14, he successfully ended the Peasants' Revolt, which filled him with confidence that God wanted him to be king. Sir Thomas Mowbray actually did kill the Duke of Gloucester. However, he was on direct orders to do so by Richard II. Richard II was married twice, first to Anne of Bohemia. Anne had a soothing effect on Richard, but she died of the plague after only 12 years of marriage, and the couple never had any children. 2 years later, Richard married Isabella of Valois, daughter of King Charles IV of France, for the purpose of creating an alliance between the two nations. At the time, Richard was 29 years old, and Isabella was 6. However, the marriage was never consummated, and the two maintained a very respectful relationship until Richard's death 4 years later. Upon Richard's death, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, wished his son Harry Percy to marry Isabella, but she refused. And once he became Henry V, Harry Percy ended up marrying Isabella's older sister, Catherine of Valois. Richard is believed to have starved to death in 1400 while imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, receiving neither food nor water. This was done specifically to prevent any one person from being held responsible for the death of the deposed king. When we get back, we'll look at some of the great actors in Richard II. Let's take a look at some of the great actors that performed in the 1978 BBC Shakespeare version of Richard II. Derek Jacobi, who plays Richard II, also played Hamlet in the 1980 BBC version, and Claudius in the 1996 Kenneth Branagh version of Hamlet, and Chorus in the 1989 Kenneth Branagh version of Henry V. John Gielgud, who plays Sir John of Gaunt, also played Chorus in Romeo and Juliet that same year. In addition, he also played Priam in the 1996 Kenneth Branagh version of Hamlet. John Finch, who plays Harry Bolingbroke, also plays the same character in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 in 1979, and Don Pedro in 1984 in Much Ado About Nothing. Mary Morris, who plays the Duchess of Gloucester, also played Queen Eleanor in the 1984 BBC version of The Life and Death of King John. Janet Moore, who plays the Queen, also plays Lady Blanche in the 1984 version of The Life and Death of King John. And Charles Gray, who played the Duke of York, played Julius Caesar in 1978, Pander in the 1981 version of Troilus and Cressida, and the Duke of Ephesus in the 1983 version of A Comedy of Errors. You might also recognize him as the criminologist in the 1975 cult classic, The Rocky Horror Picture Show. And now get ready for today's trivia challenge, which is called Making Whoopee. All right, and now it's time for today's trivia challenge called Making Whoopee. Identify the speaker of these euphemisms for sexual relations in the following plays. Number 1, groping for trouts in a peculiar river in Measure for Measure. Number 2, making the beast with two backs in Othello. And number 3, do the deed of darkness in Pericles, Prince of Tyre. When we get back, I'll give you the answers and we'll look at some relevant lessons from Richard II. Okay, let's see how you did on today's trivia challenge called Making Whoopee. You were to identify the speaker of these euphemisms for sexual relations in the following plays. Number 1, groping for trouts in a peculiar river. That was Pompey Bum in Measure for Measure. Number 2, making the beast with two backs. That was Iago in Othello. And number 3, do the deed of darkness. That was Lysimachus in Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Now, let's take a look at some final relevant lessons from Richard II. First, learn how important it is to be congruent in your words and your actions. This is what led to Richard's downfall. Next, if you're king, never put your own needs ahead of your subjects. And if you're a leader, never put your own needs ahead of the people you serve. And third, remember, it's nice to be important, but it's also important to be nice. Make sure you develop rapport with everyone, especially the people who helped you to get where you are. As the great Jackie Gleason as Ralph Cramden of The Honeymooners once said, be nice to the people you meet on the way up, because you're going to meet the same people on the way down. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when you will learn of one who loved not wisely but too well and allowed the green-eyed monster and his ancient to put him under their spell.